What's up, Internet? Welcome to Mike Does Voiceovers. My name is Michael, and this week, I'm a linguist. To non-native speakers, Irish is a truly baffling language. Verbs come first, you have all these bizarre spelling conventions, and there's literally no one rule for pluralizing nouns. But perhaps the most baffling thing about this baffling language is the phenomenon of consonant mutation. Basically, this is when the first letter, or more properly, the first sound of a word, changes under certain circumstances. What these changes are and the circumstances in which they occur seem completely random. B's become V's, T's become D's, F's disappear completely. Sometimes it happens after words like in or my, but sometimes it happens just because of where the word falls in the sentence. As one of my Irish language classmates asked our professor back in college, who decided that this was how it was going to work? Of course, no one decided that these sounds would change in this way under these circumstances. It happened naturally, or as our professor explained, it's sort of a byproduct of the way people slur their words together when they talk. That's a good start, but it's not really the whole answer. Mutations emerged naturally over thousands of years as a product of common linguistic changes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's establish what exactly these mutations are, because believe it or not, there is a rhyme and reason to every single one of them. If you're not familiar with the International Phonetic Alphabet, I've put some links down in the description to bring you up to speed on how linguists describe sounds. I recommend you check them out. Once you have, come back to this video and we'll get started. First, let's talk about the mutation referred to as eclipsis, or uru. Eclipsis is actually quite simple. Voiceless sounds, sounds that you make without engaging your vocal cords, like p, t, k, simply become voiced. You engage your vocal cords. So when a p gets eclipsed, it becomes b. You can see my mouth is doing the same thing for the regular and eclipsed sounds. The only difference is my vocal cords. P, b. If a sound is already voiced, and it's a plosive, a sound that you make with a quick burst of air, like b or g, then the eclipsed version becomes the equivalent nasal. I'll demonstrate. An eclipsed b becomes an eclipsed d becomes and an eclipsed g becomes Again, my mouth is doing the same thing, but for the eclipsed sounds, the air is coming out of my nose instead of my mouth. Eclipsis takes place in a lot of strange places. First of all, it happens after the preposition I, meaning in. So bialan, restaurant, becomes I mialan, in a restaurant. It also happens after the numerals 7 through 10. So pinta Guinness, a pint of Guinness, becomes shacht binta Guinness, 7 pints of Guinness. It also happens after plural possessive nouns. So cleave, meaning sword, becomes a glaive, their sword. And of course, that is not an exhaustive list of when and where eclipsis happens. The other major mutation in Irish, lenition, or shevu, is a bit more complicated. Generally speaking, this is a weakening mutation. Plosives, those sounds made with a quick burst of air, become their equivalent fricatives. That is to say, sounds that are made with a constant stream of air, like th. So a lenited p becomes th, b becomes v, becomes ch, g becomes r, and becomes v. Again, you can see the same parts of my mouth are moving, but for the lenited sounds they're moving in a slightly different way. As a side note, a lenited f simply disappears because it's already a fricative. That seems simple enough so far, but there's some weirdness afoot when it comes to lenition. For one thing, a lenited s and t both become h. In addition, a lenited d becomes r, the same sound as a lenited g. For most of the mutations, there's some relationship between the original sound and the mutated one. But for s and t and h, as well as d and r, that's not really the case. They have very little to do with one another. In fact, they're at the exact opposite ends of our mouths. S, t, d. That's all at the front of my mouth. But h and r, those are at the back. What gives? We'll get back to this, but it's a topic for another video. So where does lenition happen? Among many other places, lenition happens after the feminine definite article. So ban, meaning woman, becomes an van, the woman. Lenition also occurs after the numerals 1 through 6, so that pint Guinness becomes she fint Guinness, 6 pints of Guinness, if I'm not so thirsty after all. Lenition also occurs after singular possessive nouns except the feminine. So tiach, meaning house, becomes mo hiach, my house. But her house is simply a tiach. Confusing, right? On the surface, yes. But if we look into the language's past, it all begins to make sense, and we can begin to establish some sort of method to the madness of these mutations. First, let's travel to the 6th century and take a look at Old Irish, the oldest written form of the language. These mutations were still present back then. In fact, eclipsis worked exactly the same way in Old Irish as it does in Modern Irish. So that a glíomh we see in Modern Irish was a glaive in Old Irish. Lenition also worked the same way as it does in Modern Irish, with 2 huge exceptions. T became th, and d became v. If you're paying close attention, you might realize that that makes a heck of a lot more sense than the lenition that we see in Modern Irish. In Old Irish, t and d became their equivalent fricatives, just like the rest of the lenitions that we see today. So what changed? Again, we'll get back to that. Okay, so now we know that those mutations still existed 1400 years ago. That still doesn't tell us how they got here in the first place. In order to answer that, we have to take one more step back to Primitive Irish in the 4th century. This is the one that they wrote by carving lines into giant stone pillars. Here we see none of those pesky mutations. That a glíomh in Modern Irish and a glaive in Old Irish is simply an cladibas. Close, but not quite recognizable. How does this help us understand mutations? I'll try and walk you through it. Bear with me here. At first, these mutations appeared as something called allophones. In other words, different sounds that the speakers of a language hear as the same sound. Think about the letter T in English. Top, stop, don't. The letter T, the sound T, is in all of those words, but I said it differently in each one. Listen again, with a puff of air in top, without it in stop, and barely any sound at all in don't. This is how mutations began, as different ways of saying the same sound in Primitive Irish, depending on context. Eventually, these variations became part of the language's permanent grammar. So, what were these variations? Well, let's take our an cladibas and see how we got to Old Irish a glaive. First, we see lenition occur intervocalically, that is to say, between vowels. This is how cladibas becomes cladivas. Next, we see eclipsis happen at the beginning of words if the previous word ended with an N. This is how cladivas becomes gladivas. That K becomes a G. When you stop to think about it, it makes some sort of sense. Your vocal cords are already on for the n at the end of on, so it's easier to just kind of keep them on for the next sound. This is a common linguistic change called assimilation. Finally, and most importantly, we see apocope. Apocope is when the final sound or syllable of a word disappears for various reasons. In our case, let's go with just 'cause. And it happened all over the place between Primitive Irish and Old Irish. This is how those changes that made perfect sense in context became these freakish mutations. The context that caused the change disappeared, but the change itself didn't. That's how we got from an cladibas in Primitive Irish to a glaive in Old Irish. And of course, many, many other changes have happened in the last 1,000+ years to bring us to a glaive in Modern Irish. It's fascinating when you think about it. In a way, Modern Irish mutations are a window into the language's past, the way people spoke thousands of years ago, an echo of sounds and words that are simply no longer there. If you think that's as cool as I do, please subscribe. Remember, we've got some unfinished business with lenition, and you won't want to miss that. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful weekend.